Okay, hey, welcome back. We are going to take a look today at some of the specific Puritan characters, which I think I may have said a couple days ago we were going to look at the next day and never got to, but we're going to actually look at them today. I'm going to start out with a date, and that's the year 1627. Go ahead and note that down. You don't have to memorize that, but I want you to have that just as a reference. If you recall, the Pilgrims, who were part Puritans, came with the Mayflower over here in the year 1620. Now, one thing you may not know is they were backed by some London investors or some London bankers. That's where the money came from for them to come here in the first place. And by 1627, those London bankers and those London investors were kind of scratching their heads saying, where's the profit? Because even though the civilization or the town of Plymouth was getting off the ground and was off the ground and was going, it wasn't producing huge returns of profit that these investors were hoping for, so they just all said, forget it, and they walked away, which meant that Plymouth and what would become Massachusetts was pretty much completely independent. That'll come up again later when we talk about the Declaration of Independence. But in 1627, a group of Puritans who were still over in England decided that this was an incredible opportunity for them. So they formed a company. It was called the Massachusetts Bay Company. And the whole goal of the Massachusetts Bay Company was to found other towns in what would become Massachusetts using this huge charter the king had given them. See, the king had given them 80,000 acres. Not only that, but he'd given them the right to govern themselves. They just had to recognize that he was their final head. He was ultimately their king. And so the Puritans in England still recognized this incredible opportunity to provide other city on a hills. In other words, other places that could be these incredible centers for truth, beauty, and goodness in the New World. And so, a man like John Endicott, you see here on the screen, John Endicott led a group early on, not long after the Massachusetts Bay Company was founded. He led them to establish a new city in Massachusetts. It would be the second city. And this was a city he wanted to name for peace, so he called it Salem. And Salem, which would later have a bad rap for the witch trials, was also known for its shipping. In fact, some of the greatest explorers, some of the greatest navigators, men like Nathaniel Bowditch, for example, came from Salem. And if you ever visit Salem, you'll see all these evidences of their great nautical past. They were people who loved the sea and loved being the ones who could say, yeah, we got to England or we got to Australia faster than anyone else did. They were very competitive. But Salem, founded by John Endicott and the people that came with them, also established some of the very first courts. And what's incredible about these courts is that the judges in these courts would take a look at previous cases that had happened, and they would see, okay, how did a previous judge handle a certain situation that might be like mine? So they understood what we call judicial precedence. They understood that you need to look at the wisdom of other people in authority like yours to make a wise decision. Now, a few years later, actually in the year 1630, another date you should know, another Puritan came. His name was John Winthrop, and if you recall, I read to you some of John Winthrop's City on a Hill speech that he gave to the people that came with him when they first landed here. Only John Winthrop's expedition was much bigger than John Endicott's, and it was much bigger than the expedition of the Pilgrims. It actually had 706 people on board 11 different ships. And in that year, 1630, they landed in roughly the middle of the coast of Massachusetts, and they founded the city of Boston. He gave his City on a Hill speech in which he called for things like justice and mercy and humility. He called for the community to be tied together. But very quickly, they began to establish not just a place for people to live, but for a place that would be designed for people for centuries to come. That's why, after only 2 months there, they established the Massachusetts General Court, which is the oldest court in the New World. Then, shortly after that, they established the Boston Latin School, which is the oldest school in North America. It was a school that taught you Latin, that would eventually teach you Hebrew and Greek as well, so you could eventually be admitted to what would become Harvard. But Harvard wasn't around yet. Harvard would be founded once people went through the Boston Latin School and had finished all the requirements of that place. They needed yet another place to go on to. And so Harvard started when a group of pastors and a group of students who had finished the Boston Latin School met in the study and used the books of a man named John Harvard. And they simply sat around, read the classics, and then discussed the great ideas of the past. That was the whole design of Harvard. How can you actually teach someone all the wonderful things and the wisdom of the past so they can actually apply to their life and actually change them? That's what made Harvard incredible, and one of the great things that the Puritans did at Boston. One more thing I want to mention about what the Puritans did at Boston was the Puritans also established the very first civil rights, or the very first Bill of Rights, when they established the Massachusetts Body of Liberties. This basically said what the government could do and what they couldn't do. It basically made it very clear what the rights of individual people were. It's one of the great reasons why the Puritans really were the founders of our method of government and the way that we think, even though they didn't always do things the way that we sometimes moderns like. But that's beside the point. Another character, actually a couple that I want you to note, was the husband and wife known as Simon and Anne Bradstreet. Now, Simon was actually someone who did lots of incredible things. At one point, he was a judge. At another point, he was an ambassador. At one point, he actually gave advice directly to the king when he was still in England. He was a lawmaker. Eventually, he became the governor of Massachusetts. And as incredibly influential as Simon Bradstreet was, Simon was also known as a patron of the arts. That meant that when he found artists, or when he found writers, for example, he was often someone who would buy their work or simply give them money so they could keep producing their beautiful works. This started, really, with his wife, Anne. Anne, who he married when she was only 16, was someone who had taught herself the humanities. She had taught herself history. She had taught herself languages. She had taught herself literature and poetry, simply by reading out of the books that were in her father's library. But they were married when she was very young. She continued reading. She continued her own education. And by all accounts, they had a happy marriage. In fact, they had 8 children together, and Simon was very encouraging towards Anne's great talent, which was writing poetry. In fact, she was the first American poet. If you take a book, the Oxford Book of American Verse, which is a collection of all the great poems from our history here in America, you often will find Anne Bradstreet as the very first entry because she was the first true American poet writing in English. And what she often wrote about were things that were near and dear to her heart, things that had to do with her own family. Let me read you a couple selections from some of her poems. For example, she wrote this about her husband. She said, "If ever two were one, then surely we. If ever man were loved by wife, then thee. If ever wife was happy in a man, compare with me, ye women, if you can." Another incredible poem that she wrote was after her home burned. After her home and most of what she had worked so hard at actually ended up in ashes on the ground. She wrote this, "And when I could no longer look, I blessed the name that gave and took, that laid my goods now in the dust. Yea, so it was, and so 'twas just. It was his own, it was not mine. Far be it that I should repine." In other words, that little poem right there about how she feels after losing all the things that she's known in terms of material possessions, it once again gives you a picture that the Puritans were a people who were content, a people who recognized they should show constant gratitude for the things they've actually been given. Another character that we'll talk about today, and actually the last character for this session, was a man by the name of John Eliot. And John Eliot is someone who you can tell his story if you look at an old seal of the state of Massachusetts. See, Massachusetts has a new modern seal, but they used to have an older one that had a picture of an Algonquin native on the front of it, and there's like a little comic strip blurb coming out of his mouth in which he's saying, "Come and help us." In other words, the Algonquins were highly interested in these Puritans. They were the newcomers, and they wanted to know, are these people like the Spanish? Can we trust them or not? And the Puritans typically had very good relationships with the natives. They typically paid for their land. They typically worked out working relationships with them and lived alongside of them. And John Eliot was one of those leaders in that area. Eliot, who himself was a pastor, a little town called Roxbury, was someone who became what was known as the apostle to the Indians. And specifically, in order to reach the Algonquins, he learned their language. He learned to speak Algonquin, and he even translated the Bible into their language so they could actually speak it themselves. He then went on a 70-mile circuit. That means that once or twice a month, or even sometimes more than that, he would travel 70 miles on horseback, going to all of these Algonquin villages, many of which he actually helped to found. These villages became known as praying towns, not just because they were places where there was eventually a church or some type of worship service, but because these were places where the Algonquins actually practiced things like settlement. They actually built real villages that were kind of modeled after the Puritan villages. Places where there was farming, places where there were schools, places where there was weaving and actually producing of goods, and places where there was real tight-knit community. What's sad about these praying towns is that during one of the many wars that the English fought against the French, the Algonquins were on the wrong side of the struggle. They were seen as somebody allied with the French. And so they were taken from these praying towns and they were put on prison ships out in the harbor of Boston. Now, Eliot, who didn't just say, that's awful, that's bad, didn't just stop there. Eliot actually became essentially a prisoner with them. He went to these Algonquins. He stayed on the prison ships with them. And when we come to why did he do all of these things, well, we can look at Eliot's own words. He explains why he did these things. He says this, "Pity to the poor Indians, a desire to make the name of Christ chief in these dark ends of the earth, and not the rewards of men, were the very first and chief moves, or motives. If I know what first did move in my heart, when God was pleased to put upon me that work of preaching to them." So he did these things simply out of pity and out of a desire to serve Christ. That's what motivated him, and that's what motivated most of these Puritan heroes. That's why they're worth studying. We'll take a look at one of the greatest names of Puritanism, which is Cotton Mather, tomorrow.